You might want to change your display setting.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much. Display settings at the top here, and it would just be.
First one's flower. There you go.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of the Faculty Presentation Series that this season is exploring 9/11 on its 20th anniversary. My name is Joseph Hendricks. I teach in English program. I help organize the presentation series. After the presentation, there will be a few minutes for Q&A or further discussion. There are some cookies over there, so please help yourself. Let me introduce our presenter for tonight, Linda Manning, associate professor. She has taught literacy courses in the education department for prospective teachers, also teaches one of the portal classes for our young freshmen. Over the past decade, Linda has encouraged her students to participate in America Reads in private and public schools areas in Cedar Rapids. She and her education students have collected nearly 3,000 books over 7 years and traveled all the way to South Dakota to deliver those books to St. Joe Indian School, which is a residential school for Lakota students. So she does a lot of good stuff. Tonight, she will share the stories of individuals who on 9/11 found themselves at the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, or on Medicine 93, and see where we're found. Their acts of selflessness and heroism. Please help me welcome Linda.
Thank you, Joe. So today I was going to start with audience participation because I'd like to get the audience participating, but I think I'm going to move that toward the end. So today I'm going to start with just some reflections of my own, living in Iowa when 9/11 happened. And before that, I wanted us to kind of take a look at the area that was most affected, because we had several areas, the Pentagon, the Twin Towers in the financial district in Manhattan that were attacked, as well as a plane that was diverted by the passengers that was thought to be either heading to the United States Capitol or to the United States or to the White House. And so most of the damage, and the first that we heard about as Americans, the planes were diverted to the financial center. I wanted us to kind of take a look at this. Some of the stories that we're going to hear are set in the Twin Towers. And so the World Trade Center is located, as I said, in Lower Manhattan. And you have Battery Park. That's where people like to go and get ready to board ferries that will take them over to the Statue of Liberty. And so the World Trade Center is right here. And while some of us may think of it as just these two towers, it really was quite a few. It was an area that encompassed many buildings, and all together they were called the World Trade Center. I did travel there in 1990. And so I was able to go downstairs. There's a lot of shopping, things that people would need that were coming in and out of the World Trade Center. And the two Twin Towers, Tower number 1 was the first tower to be hit. And then Tower number 2 was also the next tower to be hit. And so we can see how this whole financial center was affected by the events of 9/11. You can see that they had a hotel, and there were other, hotels and federal buildings and more financial buildings across there. And so this is that area. In addition to that, up on top of the World Trade Center Tower number 1, there was a fancy restaurant called Windows on the World, and on a great day, you could see 50 miles out past the two rivers, the Hudson, and I think it was the East River. And so the night was, I was probably about 26, I think, and it was so much fun. We met somebody who worked there, and we just attached ourselves to that person, and we went up to the I think it's on the 106th floor and 107th floor, all these, this windows on the world where you could, have drinks. Men could not enter unless they had a coat. And the staff was ready with coats for men because it was a fancy restaurant. And so anyone who wanted to go in there had to be dressed appropriately. And luckily, that night, we were dressed to go to a Broadway play. And so afterwards, we were able to go up and we were dressed nicely, so we were allowed in. And it was a pretty neat experience for a young person. So this is that area that was affected. I kind of wanted us to take a look at it and just to understand. If you'll see number 8, that's a bridge where a lot of the firefighters will eventually find their way there so that they can look out and then deploy men to where they needed them to be, men and women to where they needed them to be. So also just kind of taking into perspective that in 2000, let's see, the World Trade Center was the tallest building until 2001. And it was after that, in 2015, that they finally finished building the building that is now considered the tallest building in the world. And you can see the difference. It's almost 1,000 feet higher than the World Trade Center was. And that is located in Dubai. And so some of you might have seen that in programs or whatever, but yeah, it is the tallest building now. But you could see it in comparison to the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. I've been up there. I don't think I've been to the Chrysler. Is that the one in Chicago?
Chrysler in New York.
In New York also. Okay, so I have been to the Empire State Building, so and the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center as well, all that. So just to get into perspective of why someone would want to attack America in the financial center of the world, basically, because a group of individuals across the way thought that, it was a symbol of greed and power, and so there will be a group that will make their way into the heart of the financial district of the United States. So, it was an ordinary day. By all accounts, the air was crisp. The September blue sky was beautiful, a color that would just, inspire. The sun was bright with promise. Now, in mornings, I often listen to the news as I'm getting myself ready, and that day was no exception. So for those of you that were present during that day, you probably have your own memories of what you were doing when this particular incident happened. And so that morning, I was getting my son, who was 4 months old, ready to go to daycare. And so I got his bags and I headed out the door, and I turned around to shut the television, and I caught a glimpse of the World Trade Center on fire. And by the time I reached the daycare provider's home, because it was an in-home provider, the images were, everybody was stunned. The newscasters were trying to figure out what was happening. People were, standing around. You could see some of the film crews that were already there and present. And so it was a wonderful day that immediately turned to horror if you stopped. And so by the time I reached the daycare, the images on the television showed smoke that was billowing out from the North Tower of the World Trade Center. So this was my day. And as I handed my son over to the provider, I stood there, we both stood there kind of in disbelief of what we were seeing, because everybody was trying to figure out what was going on. But this is our first hero. She understood what was going on. They could not get into the cockpit. They had no communications with the pilots because individuals in first class had made their way into the cockpit and had locked the doors. And they were trying to figure out what was happening. They couldn't breathe. Apparently, the hijackers had sprayed mace within the body of the plane as they were moving around. You know, they might have gone to the restroom and, you know, deployed some things along the way, and eventually those at the front who were there, because there were about 5 or 6 hijackers on this plane. Betty Ong was the first one to actually reach their call center and was able to speak with individuals to try to let them know what she was experiencing and what she was seeing. And in that panic call, she was very calm. It seemed like the individuals who were taking the call were asking her, like, who are you? And yet it was the call center for their own airlines. And so they lost precious time. Between her and another flight attendant, they were able to be on the telephone call to alert the airlines of what they thought was happening, because they had no communication with the cockpit. And so in that process, they were able to eventually locate where those individuals were seating, because now their seats were empty. And so this is a short telephone call that you'll hear here. I think it's important to listen to her voice and to hear the calmness of how she is responding to what she thinks is occurring.
When I took the call over, there was a soft-spoken, calm gentleman on that.
Okay, that was not the right one. Okay, so I think this might be it. This is her family kind of reflecting on her experience.
Covered by her phone has finally made it appear. This Saturday marks 20 years since the September 11th terrorist attack. Tonight we're remembering the heroism of a flight attendant who was also a San Francisco native. She was on the first plane to crash into the World Trade Center. Her name was Betty Ong, and today Casey and Amber Lee talked with her brother about the family's sadness and pride 20 years later.
Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Coleman offers solace and solitude for Harry Young when he comes to honor his sister Betty Young. She was the flight attendant on American Airlines Flight 11, credited with being the first person to alert authorities to the deadly hijackings that took place September 11, 2001.
I just have that. That just wasn't there for her. This was really hard to feel otherwise.
Also, his sister's last words during a phone call to report the hijacking reflect her courage and poise. 2001.
As we heard in this short clip, her voice was pretty calm, and along with her other peer, she was able to give valuable information. As a matter of fact, this flight was going from Boston to California. And so obviously she was from California, so that was her route that she was taking. And so she was able to let them know what was going on. This information is then going to be relayed to authorities who will soon be finding out that indeed there is an attack. This is not an accident. And so she was the first one even before the plane hit. About 15 minutes after takeoff from Boston Logan Airport, Flight 11 is hijacked by 5 Al-Qaeda members, and they turned the plane toward the first tower. They were very calculating, and they knew exactly what their plan was. The other flight attendant on that on Flight 11 was Amy Sweeney. She's the mother of 2, and she too was not supposed to be on that flight. As a matter of fact, she called her husband, and she was missing a family event because, and her children were young. I think they were toddlers. And so she was just making sure that everything was fine at home. And she was kind of a little bummed because she really didn't want to work that flight, but somebody had called in ill. And so she decided to step up and do that. And that was her nature, was to do that. So on that day during that flight, when things were going awry, she was able to get herself to the back of the plane and sit in the last row and continue to call along with Betty Ong. They traded and gave information. She was actually the one that was able to identify the seats on which the attackers had been sitting. This information is important because they have a flight record. And so immediately they can see who purchased those tickets. And back then, we did not have the kind of screening that we have now to get on airplanes. We could go in and we didn't go through metal detectors. Now this is the primary source, is that you are on a no-fly zone list if you are a person of interest that the government is following. They certainly check us for metal. You go through a metal detector. They make sure you take off your shoes and everything. Well, back then that wasn't the case. So the terrorists were able to carry on box cutters, knives, mace, and other things that they needed, to do what they were going to do. So she was very vital because at that moment, when she relayed that information, they got on and looked at the flight seating, and they were able to locate who those individuals were. So information was being relayed that was so important. As we know, this was the first plane that hit Tower 1. It was 8:06. It hits the tower. There are 92 passengers and 5 hijackers on that plane, and they perished. The building went on the floors that were hit. They definitely got caught on fire. The hijackers wanted to get a plane and get flights that were scheduled for a long trip, meant more fuel on the planes without having to stop to refuel. And in addition to that, they were also noting that it was going to be long, so if something happened that they had the time, it was not going to be a short flight. So it also had all that fuel, and it was a short time from Logan to New York City, and so they would have lots of, fuel to set that building on fire. And initially, Tower 1 stood. it stood longer than Tower 2 did. As a matter of fact, Tower 2 went down before Tower 1 did. And so our next heroes, while this is happening, Joseph Pfeiffer, he woke up that morning with his team, at the firehouse, and he had a call. And they were going to go check out maybe a leak of gas somewhere downtown. And so that was where they were. They were close to the World Trade Center. That's where their firehouse was located. And so he was on the scene, and we actually have a short video. In addition to all the men going, they had two French documentary filmmakers, and what they were trying to document was a new probationary firefighter who was going through his first 9 months, and they have to go through different routines, and they have to pass certain inspections and tests. And so they had a probie, is what they called them. It's a new person who's trying to kind of get his wings or get his full certification to be a firefighter. And so the filmmakers were there. And immediately when they were on call, these documentary filmmakers would get on the trucks, the fire trucks, with the chief and all the other men that went. And so they actually were not far from the World Trade Center because that was their area that they patrolled. And they were there to look at a gas leak nearby when the photographer or the videographer, they all heard this plane come by. We actually have footage of the plane hitting the building. This is only a minute and a half. It's a routine call. And all of a sudden, they're going to hear a plane. So they repeat that over and over again. I apologize for that colorful language, but it is the reaction of the people on the ground seeing a plane that was not supposed to be in that part of New York. They have, they have a fly zone, and they have areas where they're not supposed to fly into. So that was what was so unusual to them, is that they heard this loud airplane, and that's why they looked up. And they were just on a routine call that morning, and they were not far from the World Trade Center. So the chief is going to be the first one there, in terms of he's going to end up doing a lot of, he's going to call other units to come in from other boroughs, and they're all going to go to Tower 1 and eventually to Tower 2 when that tower also gets hit as well. So he's going to be the man in charge, and he's going to make a lot of decisions. And initially, he tells his men to, their mantra is to go in and save people. That's the first duty that they have to people in trouble is to save them, to take them out of burning buildings or other precarious situations. And so that is a command that he'll get once all the men are there. He's going to send them up, and he wants them to go as far as like the 80th floor. Now, the World Trade Center has 110 floors. Okay, so he is going to be giving commands, and at some point he's going to realize they need to be out. This is not good. They're going to hear rumblings along the way. Wells, Remnant, Crowther, a nice young man, graduate of Boston College. He was an Eppies trader, and he worked on the 104th floor of the first tower. Now, growing up, his father was a firefighter. And so by the age of 16, Wells actually went to train to be a voluntary firefighter. And so growing up, he looked at his dad as being a hero to him. So when he was 7 years old, he was given a bandana by his father. His father wore a blue bandana. His father gave him a red bandana. Now that is going to be very significant because people that he saves are going to recognize him by that and be able to relate that to the media. So he always carried his red bandana with him. And from the moment he received it, he carried it everywhere. And he used it at times like a cowboy mask or a pirate hat. Or sometimes, you know, he would use it to flag down races in his neighborhood when he was playing. When he got to high school, he was involved in hockey teams and other kinds of sports teams, and he always wore his red bandana, so it became a signature for Wells. So everyone knew him by that. So at age 16, he did volunteer, he did go through the training, and he was given his volunteer firefighter certificate. And it was this particular training and his red bandana that are going to be crucial in him becoming a hero. So after college, he went to work at the World Trade Center, as I said, and he loved working up there. And many days he'd call his dad, and he'd just say, "Hey, Dad, you know, what's the weather like down there?" His dad might say, "Well, it's raining down here." He goes, "No, not on the 104th floor of the first tower. It's sunny." And so he made it a practice to call his father or his mother every other day. But on Tuesday morning of September 11th, it was not a rainy day. The sun was bright, and there were no clouds. And so he sat in his office, he called his dad and talked, and then all of a sudden, he looked out the window to see, oh, he was in Tower 2. He looked out the window to see that the World Trade Center, Tower number 1, was spewing fire. And that got him really alerted. And so he wanted to help out. And so just after the explosion, he left his office. And he went down to the lobby. And he went over to the other building. And he got the sky, they have a floor sky lobby, so he was able to try to get to the other building. And he found many people who were in shock. They were, you know, trying to flee the building. And, you know, so he knew that it would take too long for the people to go down the elevators. And so he started to shout commands to the people that were in panic in the building. And so when he made his way there, he heard a loud rumble. And that rumble is one floor collapsing onto another floor, onto another floor. And so the time is ticking. He ran right to the door of the sky lobby, and he could not see very much. It was smoky, and we know that because the people who were ushered by him into the hall, into the stairwell, to make it down to the ground floor, they were able to say these accounts about him. He took out his red bandana that he carried with him all the time. He put it over his nose so that it would prevent him from breathing in a lot of the fumes from the gas, from the fire. And it would help him breathe. He entered the sky lobby, and it was hard to see, and there were badly injured people who needed help to get to safety. He found a fire extinguisher and put out the flames as best as he could. And then he immediately took charge, and he started calling out to those who could hear him. He said, "I found the stairs. If you can get up and walk, get up now. If you are able to help someone else, help them. Follow me. I know the way." And many people were dazed from the explosion. One woman was in such shock that she could not walk. Wells carried her on his back down the stairwell until he got her to a safe spot. And you would think, as he was telling people to keep walking, walk all the way down, get out of the building, he went back. He went back as he carried other people back and forth into the stairwell so that they could try to make it down there to the ground floor. Many of them made it to the 61st floor, and then the lights were on and working on the bottom, but not at the top. And Wells told the group to continue going down the stairs and out of the building. And so he headed back up the stairs. He collected other survivors, and he ushered them down into the stairs. Again, he led them down to the clean air on the 61st floor. And during his third trip to the sky lobby, Wells found that there were people who were alive, but they were trapped underneath the heavy pieces of metal. And he knew that in order to save them, that he would need the jaws of life that firefighters had. And so he followed the stairs down to the lobby for his third and final trip. And he found the command center where firefighters and police officers were planning the rescue effort. And he let them know that they would need the jaws of life, but Wells would not make it up there. The damage to both the buildings was too severe, and they collapsed. And so no one knew what had happened to Wells until his mother read a newspaper article of one of the survivors describing how she had been helped by a young man that was wearing a red bandana. And it brought some peace. Two women recognized him through pictures, and they never forgot his bravery, and they said that that he had been their angel on that day. So that's Wells, Remnant, Crowther. I read in some other research that I did that his fragments of his body were found, and so they were able to identify him, and so at least that family got closure, whereas many other families didn't. They were able to locate some of his remains, and so we do know what happened to him. Now, that's one tower. Flight 175 hit Tower 2. The first one hit at 8:46, and this one hits at 9:03. It actually hits floors 77 through 87. On that flight, there were 56 passengers, the crew plus the hijack. And this is, I think, the building that will go down first. And so on that flight, we don't have much more other than, whatever information could have been relayed to the others if they had been able to call, but there are no calls that came from that particular flight. So the airlines did not know that there was another plane, and actually on that day there were 4 planes that were used as weapons of destruction. So Rick Rescorla, he was with the Port Authority, and he had actually served in Vietnam, and so he knew how when things were not going well. And so he had made a lot of decisions as one of the leaders in his platoon. He was, I think, a sergeant or something like that in the military in the Vietnam War. And so he was very much aware, and he had many times told, the people that were in charge of safety at the World Trade Center that there were flaws in their evacuation routines. So because of his training in the Vietnam War, he actually would hold, for his building, he would hold drills. And during the times that he would drill the people on how to evacuate, and that is what saved thousands of lives that day in that tower, is that while things were happening in Tower 1, and people were not moving as fast because they started to hear that bodies were falling. At first they didn't know what it was, and there were thumps. And so people were like, what's going on? What's going on? The fire chiefs didn't know what was going on, but they would hear this, and then when they were outside and they would move out, they could see that people were actually jumping off and out of the towers. And they became so many people that were falling that it was dangerous for the firefighters to be in the building because they could be hit by somebody coming down and they would be killed instantly because of the force. And so while they were hearing all this, thumping, they decided that they were going to be inside. And so one of the commands was for them to stay in the building because it was safer to be in the building than it was to be outside. And he went against that command. He said, oh no, we're getting out of here. And he immediately, because he had drilled the people in that building several times, he was able to get them out safely. Many people were saved by him. I think they said something like maybe 2,000 people were saved by him, and his efforts to get them out in an orderly fashion. And while you would think mayhem is happening outside in Tower 1 and now in Tower 2, what he used to do when he trained his building was he would sing. He would sing to them. And so it would calm them down when they were having these drills, and it kind of made it a little bit fun in the sense that, he would sing to them, and some of them would join in with him. So on that day, when this was the real McCoy, he decided he was going to get the people out and he was going to sing. And he sang, like, God Bless America, they said, and he had another favorite tune, something from his days in the military. And he sang this, and they calmly were able to walk out the building, nearly 2,000 people. And so, he is remembered for his bravery, and he did get the people out and got himself out as well. He called his wife as, he was leading them down, and she was very, very worried because she could see what was happening in the news. Our next area that was hit, it was the third flight, the third airplane, and it was hit into the Pentagon building. And so, it's got 5 sides, Pentagon, and we see, that this flight is also used as a weapon to destroy part of the Pentagon. And so the hijackers really had a plan. It was well executed, and we were nonetheless, wiser for that. The last flight was headed also to the West Coast, and this was the flight where individuals decided to take control. They were now receiving calls on their cell phones, and they were understanding what was going on and what had happened on the other 2 flights. So this is, and so they were able to understand that they would have to overtake the men that were in the cockpit, the terrorists. And so these were ordinary civilians. They decided to get together, and there was one particular young man named Todd Beamer, and he deliberated with, all of the meant that because the terrorists were in the cockpit, and so they were not going to allow anyone to get into the cockpit and stop them from what they wanted to do. And so he went ahead and worked with other men to try to open and pry open the doors, and they were able to be successful. He gave his last interview with a lady. She actually called trying to reach his wife, and he couldn't reach her, and so he called an operator, and he was able to relate to this woman what had happened, and that was to let his wife know that, you know, he was okay, that he loved her and children. And then his last words when he finished talking to the operator, who then did relay the message to the wife a few days later when they found out and were able to connect with her. The last things that he said to the individuals that were helping him to go into the cockpit, they were going to storm that cockpit and stop it because they felt that they were no longer going to the West Coast. They could see that they were turning. They could look out the windows, and they were headed to either the United States Capitol or they were headed to the White House. And so these individuals stormed the cockpit. They took over, and in the struggles that occurred between the hijackers, who were probably pumped up, and them, the plane crashed. And it crashed in Pennsylvania. And so they were heroes as well. And then we have two reservists. They had actually already served in the military. And these two men, Jason Thomas and Dave Kearns, they were listening to everything that was going on. And they were now in the reserves, and they each in separate places. They met up at Ground Zero. And what they did was they felt like they were called to be there. Jason Thomas was actually watching the news and getting his son ready to go to school. And he told his mother, I'm going to go down to New York City. It's my duty. And even though he was a reservist, he put on his uniform and he headed to Ground Zero. And he was there for like 15 days, and they were going through the rubble. He was able, along with Dave Kearns, they teamed up together, and they were able to rescue two men, firefighters, that had been stuck underneath some of the rubble. They were able to locate them, and they were able to, you know, once they told and located these individuals, they told the fire department, and then they brought in the Angels of Life, and they worked to save these two firefighters that had been stuck there. They'd been down in the lobby in that area. And so other heroes as well. On that day, we also had a no-fly zone. There were many people could not use the phone, and many people could not, all the flights were canceled. It was quiet in the skies. And so the military were the ones that patrolled that area, and so they were looking out for any other hijacked planes, and so they knew, and they were heroes as well on that day, protecting the people. They gave people solace to know that our military was flying overhead. The Coast Guard and civilian boats were also alerted. So how do you get people off Manhattan Island? There were boats in the area. The Coast Guard started calling out to all the other boats that were in the area that were civilian boats. They weren't, you know, boats that were military or belonged to the Coast Guard. And so they put out the call, and they would go up to the edge, and people would calmly get into the boats, and off they went away from danger. So there's a lot of nameless people. Americans, you know, went and helped where they could and when they could. And so on that day, you know, I thought, wow, my son is 4 years old. What world have I brought him into? And I was really sad. And the next day, this was the headline in the Iowa Press Citizen. Our nation saw evil. And I thought, no, we saw heroes. When I drove from Mount Mercy, because I came to work on that day, and I taught a class at 11 o'clock, it gets out at 12:20. I was, grading, doing things I needed to get ready for the next day. As I drove from Cedar Rapids to Iowa City on I-380 or 380, it was quiet. There were hardly any cars on the street. Luckily, I had already filled up my car, but I could see as I was passing gas stations that there were long lines. It changed America. We were under attack. Immediately, our government, put terrorist, measures into place, and legislation was passed as well. Hopefully, we will, not experience this again, that we have learned from that experience. But it definitely, I think everybody might be able to say, if you were alive and, old enough, you might remember where you were. So as an audience participation, I would like for you to turn and just kind of, where were you? What is your story? These are the stories of the heroes, and where were you when this was going on, and how did you feel, and what did you, what do you remember of that day? So if you would turn and talk, I think we have about 5 minutes, that would be great. And then if we could share out a few things of your impressions of 9/11, that would be great. So turn and talk, turn and share. So you probably weren't born, were you?
I might have been born one.
Yeah, my son was just one because it's the 20th year anniversary, so yeah.
I'll be 22, so I don't know where I would have been at.
Did your parents say anything to you at all growing up? How about your history classes? Did you ever talk about that?
Not really.
Really?
No, like,
Wow.
like you touched on it, like it was a general